If you're planning on using heart rate for racing, there's some things that you have to know. Today we are going to cover the dangers of using heart rate in racing and how to avoid getting it wrong.
So should you be using heart rate for racing? And the short answer for that is no. As you'll find out as we go through the video, heart rate can be one of the many tools you can use, but you shouldn't be the one thing that you rely on. So the first thing to understand is that racing is actually a skill. And like any skill-based activity, you need practice at it. And there isn't a single formula you can use, or you can say, you know, I'm running a 10K race, and you can have the best laid plan. You can have a pacing strategy for your first kilometer, and then 3 to 5 kilometers, and then for the end. But on the day, you still have to be able to execute that plan. And part of it is being able to manage your own self in a run. So people tend to start out too fast or start out too slow. And you need to be able to feel your way through a race and understand how you're feeling on the day and be able to manage your resources so that you can effectively manage your energy and your fatigue levels for the duration of that event, whether it's a 5K race, a 10K race, or a marathon. And what we find is that often people go out too hard in the race, that no matter how much they've trained for this, they go out and they start and they feel like, oh, it's so nice and easy. And then when they get to the last 20% of a race, is the time when you have to struggle, and people then often struggle with that. And it's the same for elite athletes too. You find that there, because there's potentially prize money in play or positions in play, that they tend to override the sensibility to say I should guard a little bit slower, and they guard a little bit harder, and then you end up having to play catch up at the end and try and sort of fight to finish. And of course, beyond just the physical part of the race, the plan and carrying it out as you want to, racing is hard. Yes, you've trained for this, you've done 12 weeks of training, but the race is going to be the hardest workout that you're going to be doing. And so no matter how well you execute your plan, we're all going to get to a dark place at some point in a run. For a 5K, it might only be for the last kilometer. For a 10K, the last 3 kilometers. And we know for a marathon, they say that the marathon really only starts from 32Ks. There's still the mental part of having to work through that part where your body says to you, you know, I'm tired, you've got to slow down, and you have to then fight through that and work through. And all of this takes time. You're not going to go out and do a race for the first time and be able to pull that off. So you're going to need multiple attempts at races to be able to put all this together and be able to run the best event that you can. And of course, outside of your own management of the event, you've got to take into account what's happening around you. You have no control. You have control over yourself, how fast you're going to go, and maybe fight into those dark moments, but you have no control over the weather. You have no control over the route. You might have trained in completely flat conditions, but you end up going to run a race that's full of rolling hills, or maybe ends on a steep 3K hill. So you've got to take all that into account. And on race day, that's also about the race management skill of it. When you go into a race and it's hot or cold, we always forget about the cold, but cold conditions also affect race performance, or it's hilly, or you're at altitude. You have to then rethink your strategy. If you set yourself up to run to a certain plan, and you go to a race and you think, you know, no matter what happens around you, you're still going to go out and run at 5 minutes a K. If that's your plan for the 10K, you're going to come into a bit of a problem. So you've got to be able to then look at the conditions around you and say, I've got to manage my race a little bit better. Slow down when it's uphill. If it's hot and windy, back off and slow down. And this is also part of why we say that if you're only looking at heart rate, as you find out later in the video, that if you stick to a strategy and a fixed heart rate, some of these factors will come into play and you lose control over the situation.
One of the other reasons that we don't like to use heart rate as the only metric that you're using for your racing is because when you start your race, you're probably going to have a higher than usual heart rate. Why? Because you've probably woken up a little bit earlier, you probably haven't slept well before your race from nerves and excitement. You're going to go into that with a little bit more adrenaline and again, excitement. And so your heart rate response is going to be very, very different to what a normal training day would be. And so if you're starting your race with a higher heart rate, it's then not reliable to use that reading to base the way you race or your pacing plan on heart rate, because you're going in there with a higher heart rate. Things like nutrition, coffee, everything you've eaten the day before is going to affect that heart rate. And again, we don't want to then go in with a higher heart rate expecting that we can then use that metric to adjust our pacing accordingly.
So one of the biggest things that impacts on your ability to get pacing right using heart rate during exercise lasting longer than an hour is cardiac drift. Cardiac drift essentially is a phenomenon that occurs as we exercise for longer and longer in response to the changing requirements in the body to exercise. So as we exercise and as exercise goes longer, your body needs to divert more of the blood to the skin so that we can cool you down. So the higher the intensity or the harder you are running an exercise, the more heat your muscles will generate. And to get rid of that heat, we need to shift blood to the skin, where we can then lose some of that heat through conduction, some of that heat through convection, and some of that heat through the evaporation of the sweat off of your skin. Simultaneously, because of that sweating and heat that we're losing through evaporation, which then cools the skin and cools the blood, we are losing fluids. So we are also decreasing our central blood volume, which really just means that there's less blood available to do what we need it to do. And in response to these two phenomena, the thermoregulation or cooling of the body and the loss of fluid from the blood volume, the heart compensates by increasing heart rate. Now that is the cardiac drift. And it's very gradual at first, but it starts at about an hour into exercise, and it really starts to become significant at 3 and 4 hours into exercise. So the longer you exercise for, the less reflective your heart rate becomes on the intensity that you are running now. And that is important to know, because it means that you can then adjust what your heart rate should be as you get deeper and deeper into a run. Because if you don't, and you have a specific heart rate in mind that you want to run at, say 155, 155 is not going to be the same intensity 3 hours into exercise as it is half an hour into exercise. And therefore 3 hours into exercise, you are actually going to be running at a much lower intensity than you're capable of, and that is going to compromise your end goal, mean that you finish too fresh and you haven't achieved what you set out to achieve. So my advice is always to use the first 30 or 40 minutes of a race. You can run that on heart rate. Adjust for that, for the nerves, etc., that Shouldnt spoke about earlier. So maybe 5 to 8 beats higher than you would normally set that heart rate at. 8 maybe a bit high, 5. And then that will give you a good idea of what it should feel like. And for the rest of the race then to rather keep control of what I should feel like, rather than being fixated on a moving target which is going to drift as the race continues.
So we don't like to use heart rates as the only metric for your racing. So what are some of the alternatives? One of those is pace, right? So minutes per kilometer or minutes per mile. And it really is a great source, because it gives you a good idea of essentially your efforts and what intensity you're running at. The risk comes in that GPS watches are sometimes going to be off in terms of pacing, right? If you're running in a big city, if you're running under tunnels, your GPS watch will be off. So your actual pace won't be reliable enough to use for your racing. So what I suggest you use then is that you actually use your splits. So the time per 3 miles or 5K as an example. That'll be a far more reliable way in using pace than just using the GPS relied minutes per kilometer or minutes per mile.
Power is a really great tool to use for racing, because it's one of the few measurements that really takes into account whether we're running on the flats, whether we're running uphill, or whether we are running downhill. So once you have set the power that you know that you can maintain over a given distance be it 10Ks, half marathon, marathon or longer, you can then control that intensity around quite a tight band because you get instant feedback from power. So as you go up a hill, there will be a change and you will see it on your monitor straight away and you won't be able to avoid it. One of the mistakes we often make on hills is that we overpower them, because by the time we realize that we're pushing it a little bit hard, by the time heart rate starts to go up, by the time our breathing starts to increase, we're already maybe halfway up the hill and we think, oh, I'm almost over the top and I'll recover on the down. Power gives you instant feedback and you are forced to then dial your pace back, because power is a function of pace, body mass and change in vertical ascent meters. So those things come together, give you a number, and that is the number that you really want to try and focus on, whether it's on the flats, on the ups or the downs. It's also a fantastic tool during training to help teach you effort at a particular pace or power. And that, as you've heard, is really the best and most effective way to get the best out of your running, but it's a skill that so few runners have got.
As Lindsay mentioned, running on feel, I mean, if you can get that right, that would be the gold standard, right? And then using all of those metrics together, that for me is the way to go. So how do we become more experienced? You need to play around with these things in your training. So if you're doing a threshold run, you will then know what that feels like. You then know how that feels when you're really going at a hard sustained effort or when you're running easy. You know what that feels like. I love it when some of my athletes get to the point where they don't even have to look at their watch and they go, oh, I'm running at 5:30 minutes per kilometer, or you know, whatever the case is in minutes per mile. So when you get to that point as an athlete, that becomes such a powerful tool. So be cognizant of that in your training. Make sure that when you're doing all these different sessions, you really get an idea of what that really feels like. So when it comes to race day, you're not attempting it there and then. You're doing that in training and you're using that and building that skill. It becomes a skill that you can then use in your racing.
Heart rate is such a great tool for letting us know what's happening inside our body. But if you think you're getting it wrong in racing, then you're almost certainly getting it wrong in training. And if you want to train to heart rate, you need to watch this video now.